Black Dahlia. Episode 21. Final Wrap-Up. In this episode, I will not be doing a recap, a final summation as you would see in an episode of Perry Mason, or a gathering of suspects as you would read in an Agatha Christie novel. To do so would cover ground already covered or put me in the pretentious position of claiming to have solved the crime. I have my opinions, but they are just opinions on a case built on numerous possibilities. This series was an exploration of many of those possibilities. It is not my goal to tell you what to think, but to provide you with information to start you on a path to come to your own conclusions. I always liked the disclaimer at the beginning of the In Search of TV show hosted by Leonard Nimoy that went.
This series presents information based in part on theory and conjecture. The producer's purpose is to suggest some possible explanations, but not necessarily the only ones, to the mysteries we will examine.
I presented as many historical aspects as possible, providing as near as complete quotes as I could find from investigators and witnesses on scene, witness and expert testimonies from the inquest, suspect interrogations, etc. I tried to cover as many angles as possible for the simple fact that every witness and even every investigator or reporter saw things through their own unique perspectives. If a group of diverse individuals witness a crime, they will provide diverse viewpoints of events and descriptions. Even investigators will provide differing views of a crime scene based on their professional experience and qualifications. A traffic cop will not see a murder scene with the same eyes as an experienced homicide detective. Just as an experienced crime scene reporter will see things differently than a gossip columnist. Each historical witness, suspect, investigator, or reporter must be looked at with the same scrutiny as a modern author or researcher. Who was or is trying to hide something, embellish something for personal gain, use the situation to further a career or agenda, cover something up, sweep something under the carpet, make a buck, or make bullshit up. And who wanted and or wants to try to set the record straight or solve the murder. That's what each viewer needs to conclude for themselves. That said, I have some lingering questions that I don't believe have ever been satisfactorily answered, and observations and possibilities of my own that may or may not be of value. And so my opinions need to be scrutinized and the pros and cons thereof weighed, as you should with any other researchers. The feces and presence of other particles in Beth's stomach is a divisive issue that I think should be clarified and addressed once and for all. In episode 7 I presented this segment. Dr. Frederick D. Newbar stated at the coroner's inquest.
The stomach was filled with greenish-brown granular material, mostly feces and other particles which could not be identified.
The presence of feces in Beth's stomach is one of the most contentious and divisive elements of the Black Dahlia case. Some suggest that Beth was forced to eat feces. Others, such as researcher Larry Harnish, claim that the feces was there as part of the digestion process. Quoted from Harnish's website.
Fact: the fecal material found in her stomach was from the natural digestion of food and a result of her being cut in half, according to doctors and investigators I have interviewed.
Harnish usually does a good job of debunking many myths surrounding the Black Dahlia case, but I can think of no way that feces in the stomach would be part of natural digestion. Actual feces are not formed until food has traveled through the digestive system. As it digests, required nutrients are absorbed through the intestinal walls. Waste does not become what would typically be called feces until it is well into the large intestine after the nutrients have been removed and as more and more water is removed from the waste until it solidifies into fecal matter called stool, which collects in the rectum, and is finally passed through the anus. Although it is possible to have feculent material in the stomach, it is usually present due to severe illness, including intestinal blockage caused by 1. Impacted feces. 2. Postoperative adhesions. Scar tissue that develops after surgery and forms fibrous connective bands connecting tissues and organs that would not normally be connected. 3. Neoplasms. An abnormal tissue growth forming from cells growing and dividing faster than normal or living longer than they should. Neoplasms could be cancerous or not cancerous. 4. Hernias. 5. Inflammatory bowel disease or inflammation of the intestine. 6. Intussusception. A telescoping of the intestine where part of the intestine slides into another part of the intestine. 7. Volvulus. A twisting of the intestine. 8. Gastrocolic or duodenocolic fistulas could also account for feces in the stomach. If Beth was so ill that she had feces in her stomach, she would have been or soon would be experiencing feculent vomiting. There are links to videos and websites below that will go into more detail. But suffice it to say these are conditions either requiring immediate medical attention or would have caused Beth problems during her life. Dr. Newbar specifically stated at the inquest.
The trunk is completely severed by an incision which is almost straight through the abdomen, severing the intestine at the duodenum and through the soft tissues of the abdomen, passing through the intervertebral disc between the second and third lumbar vertebra. Severing the intestine at the duodenum.
Dr. Newbar makes no mention of the large intestine being severed. And even if the large intestine was severed, thus allowing feces into the abdominal cavity, I still don't see how feces could have gotten inside the stomach. The autopsy should have shown any of the severe medical conditions previously mentioned. And such conditions would have been important enough to show Beth's health at the time of her murder, they would have been mentioned at the inquest. So I am inclined to side with those who think Beth was forced to eat feces. If there are doctors or others specializing in the digestive system who can shed more light on this topic, please comment below. If the question has already been easily answered by experts interviewed by Larry Harnish, as he says, then there should be medical experts out there who can definitively answer this once and for all. Also in episode 7 I speculated as to what the other particles might have been. Another bone of divisive contention between theorists studying the Black Dahlia case is what is the unidentified greenish-brown granular material described as other particles. To quote directly from the inquest.
The stomach was filled with greenish-brown granular material, mostly feces and other particles which could not be identified.
So what were the granular particles? Which could not be identified? Some researchers speculate that Beth was force-fed feces. Some, like Black Dahlia researcher Steve Hodel, suggest she was fed fertilizer. That would account for the fecal matter as well, possibly accounting for the granular material, as being granulized fertilizer, which could have been added to manure fertilizer. I'll put links below that will go into more details on Hodel's website. On FAQ 76, he has pictures that he thinks are of Bandini steer manure fertilizer or Bandini fertilite found at the body dump site. I cannot comment on the composition of Bandini fertilizers of 1947. But modern Bandini fertilizer does appear to have green and brown bits according to these pictures taken from a YouTube video. This modern Bandini is called Bandini Pro Choice 21714. Although this fertilizer is mostly white, the darker granules would be good candidates for the material found in Beth's stomach, especially if they were mixed with manure fertilizer. I have no idea how this compares to 1947 variants of Bandini fertilizer. But I did find an old Bandini gardening manual on eBay from the 1950s, and fertilite was no longer listed as a product. The manual has no pictures of the fertilizers, but there are descriptions of their steer fertilizer, described as
for general gardening needs, Bandini steer manure, with its high organic content and well-rotted, weed-free particles, provides an excellent humus as well as soil conditioner. All Bandini registered balanced plant foods contain not only chemical elements, but, most important for Western soils, organic elements also.
Although fertilite is no longer listed as a product, there is a product called Bandini Organic Garden Mulch, created from ground alfalfa stems. Remember, the stomach was filled with greenish-brown granular material. Fertilizer made from alfalfa would be a good candidate for the granular material found in Beth's stomach. It would be no wild stretch of the imagination to compare these photos of fertilizer pellets with the description of the contents of Beth's stomach. And it is also interesting to note that some of these alfalfa pellets are used as livestock feed. Could the killer have viewed Beth as nothing more than livestock? Perhaps something akin to an animal used for scientific study like a lab rat or monkey for medical testing. After all, Dr. Deriver said the killer had a
superabundance of curiosity. May even be a studious type. Was the experimenter and analyst in the most brutal forms of torture. Delighted in feeling himself into the humiliation of his victim.
There are few better ways of humiliation than to make someone literally eat shit. I also wondered about if the placing of the body had significance to the rose tattoo, fertilizer, and location. Also interesting to note is that alfalfa fertilizer is often recommended for roses. Beth had a tattoo of a rose on her leg. Normally it would be a stretch to put those two facts together, but in this case, the murderer went out of his or her way to cut out the area of her leg with the rose tattoo and insert it into Beth's vagina. Could the killer have been planting a seed in a place a penis was denied entry? Or perhaps the killer did not have a penis at all. Something else to ponder is the statement by Detective Jesse W. Haskins about the body dump site. That it was filled with
weeds and grass and rose clippings and such.
Someone, probably more than one person in the neighborhood, liked to grow roses. Could Beth's killer have liked growing roses? When the killer was done with his or her work, could he or she have dumped these human rose clippings where he or she usually dumped their garden waste? Was the dumping ground an area of meaning to the murderer, or just a well-known convenient place to dump his clippings? I wonder if Walter Bayley or his wife had roses around their house, located only about a block from the body dump site. Could Bayley have dumped a bisected corpse where he usually dumped yard waste to get back at his wife? Or could his partner Partika dumped Beth there as a warning or a chance to put the fear of God into a rival? The surgical precision of the bisection is often pointed to as fact that only an experienced surgeon could have done it. But if this was as common a procedure as claimed by researcher Steve Hodel, it would open the suspect list to many more suspects. But then the police were already looking into medical students. What other aspects of the bisection could point to an experienced surgeon over a student? I also said this in episode 7. Another thing I will add is that after studying the pictures of the abdominal cavity and comparing them to the inquest testimony, it does prove that only an experienced surgeon could have done this. A point that some may still deny or overlook. The body was severed in the perfect place, between the second and third lumbar vertebrae. Much has been made of the location of the severing of the spinal column, and with good reason. But we must also take into consideration the amount of and placement of the organs. The killer must have known how to get around the different organs to cause as little damage as possible. A novice couldn't have worked their way through so much material with a sharp instrument without slicing everything to shreds. The killer knew to cut through the duodenum, the connecting part of the small intestine to the stomach, the perfect place to do as little damage as possible to the other organs. So perhaps the fine piece of surgery stated by Dr. Newbar wasn't just due to knowing the perfect spot to sever the spinal column, but also in the precision of dealing with the internal organs. But these are just speculations based on conjecture. But in the end, conjecture is all we have when the facts are sealed in the Black Dahlia case file cabinet. So, who do you think did it? George Hodel? Walter Bayley? Do you count yourself as a supporter of the Leslie Dillon did it crowd, mostly discredited even at the time by investigators like Finis Brown, who looked into every detail of Dillon's story? Hugh Eatwell's book sold a lot of copies, but there is only a narrow window of opportunity for him to have helped in the murder. Dillon didn't have the surgical skill to do it alone. Or maybe you think Mark Hansen had a hand in it, another suspect who didn't have the skill to do it alone and cooperated completely with this and other investigations, even allowing his house to be bugged. There still is the Bugsy Siegel did it crowd. I don't buy it, but the Wolf book, the Black Dahlia Files, sold a lot of copies. There are other suspects only briefly touched on, and others not mentioned in the series at all, but do have their supporters. Looking under every rock for every fringe suspect would mean a never-ending series, and in the end would detract from the more viable suspects. So who do I think did it? I'm leaning toward Walter Bayley, but with the help of Alexandra Partika. The pieces to that puzzle just seem to fit a little better, although it is missing a lot of pieces and others need to be pounded in place. Let's look at a few highlights of why this theory stands out. 1. The family connection. Although Walter Bayley's adopted daughter was present at Beth's sister, Virginia's wedding, there has never been proof that Beth met Bayley. However, this family connection is much closer than Beth had to other suspects, with the exception of perhaps Patrick C. O'Reilly, who could easily have met Beth through Mark Hansen. This and O'Reilly's self-inflicted removal of his right pectoral muscle and his proven propensity to sexual violence against women also make him a compelling suspect, but that is about all there is to go on with O'Reilly. He was also looked at the time and cleared for whatever reason. Larry Harnish speculates that this connection caused Beth's sister to tell Beth about the Bayley family, and so, in her time of need, she went to who she thought would have helped her. But something. Possibly Beth telling Bayley her usual lie about having a child. Caused a violent flashback to Bayley losing his own son. So he lost it, and in a fit of rage, murdered Beth. He then placed her body parts only about a block away from the house where his wife Ruth and the adopted daughter who he might have blamed for the death of their son still lived. See the previous episode for more details, and look into the John Douglas profile in the Killer Profile episode for information as to why the killer may have placed the body there. I think that might be part of it, but it leaves a lot of the pieces unfitted. I do think Beth heard about the Walter Bayley family, but probably through her mother. Beth had little contact with her sisters, but wrote her mother frequently. Her mother may have told Beth about Virginia's maid of honor whose father was a well-known doctor specializing in women's conditions and who performed hysterectomies and mastectomies. Remember the nearly complete removal of Beth's right breast and the chunk removed from the left, one reminiscent of a mastectomy and the other perhaps similar to the removal of a tumor. And then remember the laceration in Beth's suprapubic region reminiscent of a hysterectomy, described by Dr. Newbar at the coroner's inquest.
There is a gaping laceration 4½ inches, which extends longitudinally from the umbilicus to the suprapubic area.
Beth may have had problems with her Bartholin glands. She might have confided in her mother about her condition, and her mother would have heard about Virginia's friend's father in his medical practice. Beth was sexually uncomfortable around men, and when she learned that Dr. Bayley's partner was woman, she might have been more inclined to seek treatment. Remember, Beth was ill after Red Manley picked her up at the French residence. She supposedly spent the night in a chair in the motel room, suffering from chills and possibly a fever. She might already have been suffering from an infection of an inflamed Bartholin gland cyst. On the cold and lonely night of January 9, 1947, Beth may have left the Biltmore Hotel and ventured the few blocks to Walter Bayley's medical practice at the professional building at 1052 West 6th Street. This address was also now Bayley's home residence, and residence of not just his partner, but his lover, Alexandra Vaughn Partika. This lover had already caused Bayley to leave his wife, and he would in time disinherit his wife over her, and list Partika in his new December 1947 will to receive half his estate and the whole of his medical practice after his death, which would be less than a month later. His death certificate listed his date of death as January 4, 1948. Soon after, his will would lead to a courtroom showdown between Ruth Bayley and Alexandra Partika. But what could have led to Bayley flying into a rage and murdering Beth? Could it have been as Larry Harnish suggests that Beth told him her lie about losing a child to gain his sympathy and get money? Or could he have seen through her lie during a medical examination? Could her infection have gotten worse after treatment, and during time under the care of Bayley and Partika she said something to set him off? Remember, Bayley was suffering from a condition possibly causing violent mood swings and outbursts of violence. Anything could have set him off. Walter Bayley and Partika both enjoyed the ghoulish practice of watching autopsy and surgical procedure films while dining. Could the post-mortem wounds have been surgical practice for the relatively new doctor, Alexandra Partika, who had only entered the country as an immigrant in 1940, who listed her medical credentials as nurse. She completed her medical training with the help of Walter Bayley and was already at the time of Beth's murder a full partner in his practice. Why put a perfectly good cadaver to waste when your medical partner still needs valuable practice? That would explain the extreme violence that caused Beth's death, followed by the calm surgical expertise that followed. Or could Partika have gotten jealous after Bayley grew attracted to the far more attractive Beth, causing Partika to fly into a violent rage? I doubt we'll ever know the truth of it. Hell, any of this speculation may just be that, speculation based on pure conjecture. Placing the body in the Norton neighborhood would have served both the needs of Bayley and Partika. Bayley so that he could get back at the wife he was having marital problems with, and Partika to instill fear into her rival for not just Bayley's affections, but for his estate. Remember the John Douglas profile that said the killer placed the body in that neighborhood
because he wanted to put the fear of God in that neighborhood.
Or perhaps he or she wanted to put the fear of God into Ruth Bayley. This is all pure conjecture, but as I said earlier, the pieces just seem to fit better than in other theories. I just wish there were enough pieces to complete more of the puzzle and seal the deal on the Bayley-Partika theory. It's all just speculation that, on its own, would get nowhere in court. In a previous episode, I mentioned the book Room to Dream, where director David Lynch recounted a story that Detective Jigsaw John showed him a photograph of Beth's corpse at the body dump site taken at night with a flash, something that only the killer or the person who placed her body there could have done. Of the known suspects, George Hodel is the only one I knew then to have had an interest in photography. But in the Walter Bayley episode I noticed something interesting. To quote directly from the article,
Dr. Partika contended that all of the equipment in the office belonged to her and Dr. Bayley as partners. She admitted only that she had been using one camera which was in the office and which belonged individually to Dr. Bayley. There are no assets in this estate for an administrator to take charge of, with the possible exception of that camera, Thomasette argued. Is an administrator to be appointed only to take charge of the camera?
Of course, this only matters if the Lynch story isn't a crock of shit. But proof of the photo could be in the sealed case files. It still wouldn't prove who took it, but it could be a reason that of all the items in Bayley's medical practice, in which Partika was a partner, she only used one camera that belonged to Walter Bayley. This is an example of the only way I believe this case will be solved. The chances of solving it may be about as good as the chances of a snowball survival in hell. But somewhere, there may be children, grandchildren, or great-grandchildren who have an old box gathering dust on a shelf in the corner of an attic, basement, or garage. That long-forgotten, never looked into, box may contain the last treasured items belonging to an ancestor. One of those treasured belongings may be a photograph, or better yet, a clump of hair or blood-stained clothing from which DNA could be extracted. Otherwise, all we have is conjecture, and conjecture will only lead to more questions, questions that will never be answered to a crime that will never be solved. I hope you enjoyed this series and got something out of it. If you didn't, maybe it at least pointed you in the right direction to come to your own conclusions. In weeks to come, I will be focusing on shorter, standalone episodes while I work on more of these deeper dive investigations. I still am researching more of the Dr. Deriver cases for a biography on him. And will be researching a longer series on the axe murders that plagued the country during the first quarter of the 20th century, focusing especially on the famous Villisca, Iowa case and the New Orleans axe murderer case. I also will be doing documentaries where the outcome is known instead of just cold cases. And also will occasionally do episodes on paranormal, UFO, cryptid, and ancient legends episodes, much like the Robert Stack, Unsolved Mysteries series did from time to time. As for the Black Dahlia, I can't say this will be the last episode. Larry Harnish is still writing the book he has been working on for over 25 years now. Who knows what new light he'll shed on the case if and when he gets it published. And you never know, something else may turn up that draws my attention.